Joining me now is Jorge Baron. He is the executive director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. It is a nonprofit legal services organization here in Washington State. Well, thank you very much, Jorge, for the time. Tell me about the work of your organization in providing legal assistance to immigrants.
Sure. Well, we've been around for 34 years now here in Washington State, and ironically, we started as a group that was focused on providing assistance to asylum seekers from people of Central America back in the 1980s. We've since expanded to serve people from an average of 135 countries each year. And then we provide assistance to people both in Eastern Washington out of offices in Granger and Wenatchee, as well as here in Western Washington, in Seattle and Tacoma. And we try to help anybody who has an issue with immigration assistance, who needs help with whether it's a deportation case, an asylum application, citizenship applications, family visa petitions. We do a lot of work with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So people who can't afford private representation, and while we wish we could help more people because the demand is very high, we try to leverage as much the resources we can to help as many people as we can.
I think that most people, that the focus is so much right now on the asylum seekers and thinking that most of the people come from Mexico and Central America. But the reality is there are many more countries involved that you provide immigration and legal services for.
Yeah, no, we have a very diverse immigrant and refugee community here in Washington State, and so we see people, all the way from Ukraine, folks who have come on refugee status from the former Soviet Union, large communities from Southeast Asia, for example, that we help with. We have a significant African community. We see a lot of both asylum seekers and other folks from Africa. And then, yeah, certainly we serve a lot of people from Latin America, but you're exactly right. There's a very large immigrant community here in Washington State.
Of course, your organization has been in the front lines of this pushing back on the Trump administration zero tolerance policy. How many people are we talking about that are here in the state that are asylum seekers and that you're helping?
Well, the thing about the asylum seeker numbers is that that's in some ways been happening for a long time, right? So even under the Obama administration and even before that, because we have such a large immigration detention center here at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, we were getting people from the southern border who are being brought up to our region as they navigated the asylum process, and so we've been providing that assistance for many years. I think what's changed over the last few weeks has been a couple of things. So one is that they've expanded even the number higher because they brought in these 200 asylum seekers to the federal detention center, which is a federal prison where normally they don't hold immigration detainees. But then on top of that, some of the people that we're transferring now from the southern border were people who were parents who were separated from their children at the border. And so that added both a humanitarian concern because of the damage, the trauma that it causes that separation, but also the fact that there were additional questions that people had for us. So most of the time when we're dealing with asylum seekers, they want to know how they're going to resolve their own individual case. And with some of the folks who are parents who are separated from their children, their first concern is about their children and finding out where they were when they were going to be reunified. So that's been significant. And so, we saw the 200 people additionally. Out of that group, around 50 were parents who were separated. But one of the things that we've seen is that we've also started to see that there's actually parents who were brought directly to the Northwest Detention Center and who did not go to the federal detention center. So I think this issue of family separation is perhaps even bigger than we anticipated.
And you actually were surprised, weren't you, in finding out that some of them had been sent to the federal detention center at SeaTac, because that usually doesn't happen.
That's right. And so when we first heard about the fact that people were being brought up here, it was actually somebody from the press who had actually reached out to us saying, apparently there's this big group of asylum seekers who's being transferred up here. And we thought that it was part of the regular transfers that go to the Northwest Detention Center. But later, our colleagues from Texas who have been working with some of these individuals reached out to us and gave us some names of people that they were trying to locate who said had been transferred here. We went to look for them at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, which is where most of the time people end up, and they weren't there. And so then those colleagues said, well, they said something about SeaTac. And we said, well, SeaTac is where the federal prison is, but that's not normally where asylum seekers are held. But we checked there's a roster that you can search online, and sure enough, the 2 out of the 3 names that they gave us were there. And so we went to see those individuals, and I happened to be the one who was, going by the prison that day, and so I actually went in and met with these two women, and they said, there's 60 of us in this one unit that were brought from the southern border, and that's when we started unraveling this, and of course later we figured out that it was over 200 that had been transferred.
Tell me about meeting with the women and meeting with the others too as this has gone on, and the impact on them, I guess, emotionally.
I've had experience. I started my career at NERP working at the Northwest Detention Center and providing assistance to people there. But it was just emotionally, difficult to have those conversations because people were just in a particularly, difficult moment. I mean, it's important to note, these folks came, had already endured, this really arduous, dangerous journey from their home countries. The people I talked to were from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And they had made it to the southern border, and they got there thinking like we've made the journey, we've gotten here safely, and they expected that they would be at least provided some assistance, and did not expect to be detained this way, and certainly did not expect to be separated from their children. And so that was one of the first questions that I had for them, is to understand how that family separation had happened. And each of the people that I talked to individually to 4 women who had been separated from their children, and each of them broke down, just very sad about recounting the moment when they were separated, because all of them described situations where they did not expect to be separated, and in different ways they had been separated from their children. And then the next question they had for me, of course, was, when am I going to see them again? When am I going to be able to be reunified with my son or daughter? And unfortunately, I didn't have an answer for them, and I still don't have an answer for that clearly for a lot of these parents, because they're still in the process. And one of the things that was hard to explain to them was that the length of time that the process was taking for their situation was unusually long. It's been dragging on for many more weeks than is normal. And so, even if I told them, like, normally this is how long it takes, I explained to them, normally people don't end up in a federal prison. Normally they don't take parents away from their children. And so all of these circumstances was unusual and out of the ordinary. And so I don't have a good baseline for them to compare. And that's also been sort of an additional sort of trauma, right? Like the uncertainty of what's going to happen. When am I going to see my child again? And they're hearing all these messages sometimes from immigration. I mean, one of our clients said to us that at the border they had told her that their child was just going to be given up for adoption, which is not what should happen or is going to happen. But of course she believed that and started thinking like, oh my God, I might never see my child again. And so I think emotionally people have been just severely traumatized.
You're a parent. I would imagine that has some impact on you in hearing all of this.
Yes, I mean, I got to tell you, the last few weeks, I've every time I've gone home, I've hugged my kids a lot closer, because I think I've none of us, I think, for a parent, want to be far away from our kid, and certainly not like in the situation where you don't know when you're going to see them again. It just seems like that's like the most, short of like physical trauma, it's probably one of the most painful things that you can experience. And some of the kids were like the ages of my kids. We have a client who's had a 15-year-old daughter. I have a 15-year-old daughter. One of them had a 6-year-old son. I have a 5-year-old son. And so just understanding, and one of my clients said to me, I just know that she's calling for me. I could just hear her saying, Mommy, where are you? And I knowing as a parent that that's exactly how my 5-year-old would behave, right? That's like what I would expect him to be, questioning where he was if the parents were not there. That was pretty painful. And again, because they were trying to sort of, ask me like, as if they're trying to convince me. And I kept saying to them like, listen, if it was up to me, you would never be here and you would never have been separated from your parent. But not being able to give them clear answers has been one of the most difficult parts about this whole experience.
Now, your organization has helped some of the women that are detained by filing a lawsuit over what is called credible fear. Now, tell me about this legal challenge.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've noticed about these cases, so the first thing is that we're also suing about the fact that they've been separated from their children. But in addition to that, one of the things that we're concerned about and that we wanted to challenge legally is the fact that all of the people that we're helping in the situation are trying to apply for asylum, and that's their goal. And the way our process works is that in order to be able to even get to that point where they're actually allowed to appear before the immigration judge and submit their full application for asylum, they have to go through this preliminary screening that's called the credible fear interview. So it's done by an asylum officer. It sometimes is done by phone even. If you don't pass that criteria, you don't even get a chance for a full immigration court hearing. And so that's, in order to get to the next step, they have to go through that step. And immigration had not provided that for many of the people that we saw, even after they have been detained for a month. I mean, normally those screenings happen within a week or two of the person being detained. But with a lot of the clients that we're serving at the Federal Detention Center, it had been more than a month. I have a client who's going to be detained nearly 2 months before she gets her credible fear interview. And so those are situations where people are just, kind of in limbo because they can't move forward, they can't ask for a bond until they get that credible fear interview. So one of the things in this litigation is to try to make sure that people who are seeking asylum get a prompt opportunity to present their credible fear interview.
To try to push that to get the timeline going on.
Right, because I think frankly when we first started talking to some of these people, it just seemed like immigration had sort of like not been paying attention and they were going to be there in limbo potentially indefinitely until we started sort of pushing on when their interviews were going to be scheduled. And we see the litigation as another way to make sure that people have an opportunity to get their asylum case started as quickly as possible.
One of the women that is involved in the lawsuit, who's separated from her young son, she's from Honduras, she suffered a setback in court. Immigration judge ruled against giving her an opportunity to get out on bond. And now she is still stuck in not being able to see her son.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the saddest moments that we had here in the office recently has been that decision, because she was one of the first mothers who've been separated who finally, she had passed that preliminary screening that we talked about, the credible fear. So the asylum officer had found that she had, significant possibility of being given asylum eventually by an immigration judge. And so she now had the opportunity to go before the judge and say, don't keep me in detention, give me an opportunity to even pay for a bond so that I can be released and I will appear in court in the future. And we thought that she had a pretty strong claim. She's got, family members here. She has, her son that she's going to be taking care of. And she had already a credible basis to be able to stay in the United States. And unfortunately, the judge, Judge Odell, one of the immigration judges in Tacoma, found that she was a flight risk. And that she needs to continue to remain detained, and couldn't even, grant her the opportunity to pay even a significant, monetary amount to be able to demonstrate that she would show up. We think it's deeply problematic and really wrong. And so we're, of course, thinking of her and her child now, who are going to remain apparently in ORA custody. But we're going to keep fighting for her, and we're going to keep fighting to making sure that she gets reunified with her son, and that she has the opportunity to present, her asylum claim to the immigration judge.
So the president has retreated on this separation of families. Federal judge says the families must be reunited. The Trump administration says it still backs the zero tolerance policy. There seems to be an ongoing tug of war, all of this. Is it all political?
Well, I do think it's political. I think the president is trying to, use these families as a tool, basically as a way to appease his political base and to appear tough. But it's inhumane, because he's causing, permanent damage to children. I mean, we're talking about, children as young as 3, 4, or 5 years old that we've seen who are being separated from their parents. And, at the end of the day, the family separation continues, right? I mean, so he has made the statements, he issued this executive order, which is, a little bit mind-blowing to me, because, he had said for weeks that he didn't have the power to change the policy that his own administration had put in place, and then he goes and he, does this big display of showing this executive order, basically dismantling the policy that he had put in place. But at the end of the day, family separation continues, right? So the parents are still, detained here at the Northwest Detention Center. The children are still in the custody of a federal agency. And so nothing has changed on the ground, at least for the current families. It is good that in the border, they're no longer doing it, in new cases. But, the president is also going into this new policy of detaining families. So he's moving from one bad, inhumane policy to another, because he's going from separating the families to now keeping children still jailed, just now with their parents, and so we see that he's going in the wrong direction.
You were at the rally at CTAC, where thousands turned out for this event, and I think probably many people were brought out just because of the whole idea of families being separated and children being separated from their families. With that kind of turnout, what does that say about how the public feels about this issue of zero tolerance?
Well, I think we've seen, the fact that the American public reject that kind of extreme policy, right? And I think it has been a little bit encouraging over the past 2 weeks, even though, the president's executive order didn't actually mean family reunification. It did seem like a step back, right? That the president sort of backed off of something, which is something that, frankly, I've been discussing with colleagues that, Trump rarely does, right? He rarely backs down from a bad policy. And so I think it's been, interesting to see that the pressure of the American public did lead to some changes. And I think the question that I have for people, or the message that I have for people who've been new to this issue, who've been brought into the discussion about immigration because of this extreme policy of family separation, is to understand that that's been happening for a long time, right? That family separation happens in the immigration context in many other ways. So, the Supreme Court, of course, recently upheld the Muslim ban, right? Well, that's separating families, people who are trying to petition for their children or their relatives to come to the United States. That's currently, now the law. We see when people get detained by immigration, by ICE officials here in our communities. There's, the same week that we were talking about family separation, there was a workplace raid in Ohio that detained 140 parents, and many of them, 140 workers, but many of them might be parents who left children behind at school while they were detained when they were at their work. And we see that here locally all the time, that parents are detained and children are left behind. And so we hope that while we totally understand that the particularly egregious policy of doing this sort of on an intentional basis, as making that a kind of a goal to separate children from their parents, was something that people kind of viscerally reacted to, we hope that it will also serve as an entry point for people to understand how many other things happen in the immigration context that most people would just completely reject. One of the things that I think I've seen is people reacting to the fact that the children who are separated from their families, for example, are now facing immigration judges on their own, that they don't have a right to an appointed counsel in immigration proceedings. And the idea of having a 3 or 4-year-old representing themselves in court is, boggles the mind to anybody. And so a lot of people are now getting to hear that, understand that, and react to that. So we hope that this will be a way for people to get more engaged in the subject, because I think, unfortunately, that's part of the reason that we've had this policy standstill in some ways in terms of changing immigration law, is that a lot of people are just not quite aware of what's happening on the ground.
So the fight goes on.
But the fight definitely goes on.
Yeah. Jorge Baron, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Enrique.
Watch CityStream Thursday nights at 7 on the Seattle channel, or get video on demand and podcast anytime at seattlechannel.org.